Well, the photos that you've been looking at, that have been scrolling up here as you came in, those are of Biosphere 2 in Arizona. And we're going to talk about Biosphere 2 for a few minutes here. For 2 years, scientists sequestered themselves in this artificial environment that's called Biosphere 2. And inside this self-sustaining community, these biospherians created a number of mini environments. These included a desert, a rainforest, an ocean, and nearly every weather condition could be simulated with the exception of one, and that was wind. Over time, the effects of this windless environment became apparent to these scientists. A number of the acacia trees bent over and snapped with no wind. Without the stress of wind to strengthen the wood, the trunks grew weak and couldn't hold up the tree's own weight. And without the wind, the trees could never fully mature. They would collapse under their own weight. And you see, in God's environment, that wind causes the trees to move in directions that they wouldn't otherwise go. And the wind-induced environment that God created causes stress on the load-bearing structure of those trees. And to compensate for that wind, that stress on their trunks, the trees grow what's known as reaction wood or stress wood. And this stress wood enables the tree to endure the wind, and it even enables the tree to move in directions that are just so prime for the best sunlight and the best resources for the health and the growth and the maturity of the trees. This stress enables that tree to support itself in contorted shapes, to bear significant loads, and to receive those optimum resources. That stress makes that tree strong enough to withstand the wear and tear that it will experience in life. The tree has to have the stress to survive. And you know, although we may not like stress, guys, this is sounding biblical to us, isn't it? You know, while our culture shuns hardship and applauds luxury and ease, we have to remember that God uses hardship for our benefit, for our good, that we may come to share in His holiness. That's at Hebrews 12:10. These acacia trees that we've been talking about, you know, they even help me to understand those real hard words in James chapter 1. You probably know the ones that I'm talking about. For James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, he tells us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let that perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So as we continue our study in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2 tonight, the title for our discussion is "Despite Adversity, the Faithful Serve." Despite adversity, the faithful serve. Let's open up to chapter 1. 1 Kings chapter 1. The title for our first division is Solomon is Anointed. And you've studied it, you've talked about it in your discussion groups tonight. But you know, some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we look at these verses here is that during this long reign of 40 years, David unified the nation, he defeated their enemies, successfully organized kingdom affairs, and he prepared for building of the temple. David has lived a full, a fallen, a repentant, a faithful, a heartbroken, and a successful life. David has faced the headwinds of life. And his best work may be right ahead of him as we pick up these verses in chapter 1. At verse 1, we see that when King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers on him. So they searched for and found the beautiful Abishag to serve the king and take care of him. And she can lie beside him so that our Lord the King may be kept warm. So as King David struggled with the challenges of these twilight years, something else is beginning to happen, as you know. Another son is planning to make himself king without his father's blessing. At verse 5 in chapter 1 there, you see Adonijah proudly proclaim, "I will be king." So Adonijah, with this proclamation to be king, he follows in those ill-advised footsteps of his brother Absalom. You know, he goes out and he gathers up the chariots and the horses with 50 men to run ahead of him, in some way proclaiming this qualifies him to be king. And for some reason, Absalom and Adonijah have both missed their father's wisest choices in his best years. Those were those days that we studied back in 2 Samuel, if you'll remember. Those are those days when King David repeatedly, as you remember this phrase, repeatedly inquired of the Lord and walked in obedience. David repeatedly inquired of the Lord. Looking back at verse 7 in our text there, we see that Adonijah conferred with Joab and Abiathar. And, Joab, David's military commander, or at this point we know former military commander, and Abiathar was the priest serving under David. Now the question for us, why did Adonijah pick these two guys to confer with? Why did he pick them as his counsel? Well, worldly wisdom tells us that if he had David's military commander and the priest serving under David, there's no way that Adonijah would lose. But look at verse 8. Among the list of those not joining Adonijah were Zadok, Benaiah, and Nathan the prophet. Those are key names that we've become familiar with. These guys that were not joining Adonijah, they weren't invited to the party either, as you recall, at verse 9. And also among those uninvited was Adonijah's brother Solomon. So clearly Adonijah only wanted to celebrate with those that he knew that would be loyal to him, that would support him. And Adonijah likely had special plans for those who would not be loyal to him. And with those plans in mind, why spoil his party by having them present? Why spoil the party by having these other guys there among his loyal supporters? But can't you just see how this works? Adonijah only wants the fellowship of those who will say what he wants to hear. We've talked about that in here before. When we seek wise counsel, who do we go to? We've got to test ourselves. Are we going to people that will tell us the truth, the hard truth that we need to hear? Or are we going to seek out those that will tell us exactly what we want to hear? Well, you know what Adonijah chose. Those not on board with Adonijah, they're going to be excluded. And if necessary, as you know, they will be eliminated. And such is the way of the world, guys, if we face that reality. So what does that say for you and me? If we're known by our faith, there are going to be many parties and many celebrations that you and I are not going to be invited to. And if for some reason we get invited to the worldly party, and if for some reason we find ourselves there, We are called to honor the one who called us. And be assured that's not going to be the party host. That's not going to be the party host. And guys, as we grow in our faith, we become more obvious, don't we? And as we become more obvious in this world is going to push against us. This world will work to exclude us. This world may work to remove us. And Jesus promised that that would happen. You know, at John 16:33, Jesus told his disciples, he said, "In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world." I have overcome the world. Take heart. Look back at verse 11, and you see Nathan the prophet, this loyal servant of the Lord, this faithful friend of King David. You know, Nathan's that type of friend that tells you the hard things that you need to hear. We need more Nathans. We need to be Nathans to our friends and those around us. But we see Nathan go to work again. Nathan and the rest of Israel know that Solomon is to become king. When David announced the construction, the building of the temple, he announced Solomon. So Nathan alerts Bathsheba to Adonijah's plan. He advises her how to save her life and the life of her son Solomon. And Nathan, as you know from experience, knows how to get David's attention. He has a masterful way of communicating with his dear friend, as you saw when he confronted David about Bathsheba and Uriah. Nathan can deliver the hard messages. And he again courageously acts to advise this frail King David about Adonijah's usurpation of the throne that's taking place right before their very eyes. He advises David about this impending death threat to Bathsheba and Solomon. And Nathan's effective again, as you study for tonight. He convicts David of this promise, this previous promise that he had made to make Solomon king. And this frail, bedridden king responds. You can just feel him power up. That energy surges through him that you haven't seen in days. And David makes the pledge, this promise again to Bathsheba at verse 29. He says, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." Those are powerful words from a man who couldn't even keep warm. You know, David, he's God's anointed, and it's time that he act like it. And that's what he's doing right here. There's an old saying that's very applicable in this circumstance. That saying is, a crisis isn't what makes a person. A crisis shows what a person is made of. And this is David's moment. This may be his finest. At verses 28 through 40, David plans and directs Zadok, Benaiah, and Nathan to anoint Solomon. He lays out the plans. And at the sound of the trumpet, all of the people shout, "Long live King Solomon." And this proclamation, as you recall, was so loud that the ground shook. And you know that celebration, that Adonai celebration that's going on down the street? They were so shaken that the guests in attendance scrambled for the exits. They were fearing for their own lives. And in this bedridden condition, you know, David, at that moment when he was faced with that dilemma, he could have easily rolled over and claimed a sick day. You know, he could have rolled over and said, "Man, I have done enough. Remember, I killed my 10,000s. I have served God. I have served my country. It's time for somebody else to take care of this. But he didn't do it. You know, he could have reasoned that he had already lost one son to rebellion. And he didn't want to face that again. But David did not shrink from that challenge. David did not shrink from that call to serve. David clung to the faithfulness of God as his own. David chose to serve. The principle for that first division is that adversity equips and conditions the faithful for service. Just like those acacia trees, adversity equips and conditions the faithful for service. And the applications for us here, guys, what limitations do you claim to exempt you from service? What limitations do you claim to exempt you from service? And then on the other hand, how have the headwinds of life strengthened you for service in the face of adversity? How have those past difficulties that you have faced prepared you for even greater ones? You know, as members of the body of Christ, many of us don't search for opportunities to serve. Sometimes we just don't look. We just don't search for those opportunities to serve. And you know, that used to bother me. You know, not searching for an opportunity to serve. But I began to realize when I search for an opportunity to serve, I'm looking for things that enhance my self-image. I'm looking for things that bring some sort of gratification to me. You know, when I start searching for an opportunity to serve, I want to make sure that it fits me well and doesn't cost me too much. And once I began to realize that, I began to see more opportunities to serve. I began to see those things that God puts right before my own face. You know, when I began to rationalize, you know, that these opportunities don't fit my plan, they don't fit my self-image, that it's going to have to take me away from my work, my family, my hobby, television, my leisure time. You know, when I think about those excuses, I think about a friend of mine, and I've told you about him in here before. And it's the story, my friend's name is Marcus Ross. And he's passed now, but left this lasting impression on me. And it's been on my mind throughout this lesson. But Dr. Ross, he had served as the city of Galveston mayor. And he had served his community there as a physician. And he had also served the medical community there as a professor at the medical school. By the time I met him, he had had a career of successful service that was amazing. It was all behind him. He was in his twilight years. But shortly after I met Dr. Ross, he lost both of his legs. And he was losing his eyesight as he and I became friends. And I sometimes visited Dr. Ross at the nursing community where he lived. And one day I walked into his room and I found him in his wheelchair. He was slumped over his desk. And when I put my hand on his shoulder, he looked up and he said, "Les, I'm praying that God will show me why I'm still here. In all this, He must have a purpose for me." You know, later in other visits, Dr. Ross would joyfully tell me about God's answer to his prayer for his purpose. He would tell me that he began to understand and see what was right in front of him. He knew that what those people in that nursing community needed most was conversation and companionship. And he could do that. He could do that. So from that day forward, once he discovered the purpose directly in front of him, Dr. Ross would wheel himself through that facility on a daily basis and stop and talk and listen to his neighbors. He could do that. He had found his purpose. And you know, in God's eyes, those may have been his finest hours. Think about this again. Consider our application for tonight, for this first division. What limitations do you claim to exempt you from service? What limitations do you and I claim to exempt us from service? All right, second division. Solomon is charged. This is chapter 2. You know, in our first chapter, we saw that David, despite the adversity, faithfully served. In chapter 2, we see that David demands that his son Solomon do the same. David demands that his son Solomon faithfully serve. You know, Solomon, he was a young man who had lived a sheltered life. And David knew that Solomon was going to face difficulty. And as you know what we read about in chapter 1, you could see what's coming too. He would face those difficult decisions that required difficult action. Difficult decisions that would put him face to face with his father's former military commander and his father's former priest. You know, and as we contemplate it, as we think about what David is going to do here, let me ask us, you know, what words would you leave your loved ones in those circumstances? What would you tell them when you knew that in a short time you weren't going to be around any longer? You know, these may be David's finest words. This may be the best that he could have said to his son Solomon. So look at verse 1. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. He tells Solomon, I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and his commands, his laws, his regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this, Solomon, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep the promise that he made to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. Powerful words. You know, and these should sound familiar to us, you know, as we think about it, because these verses should remind us of what God said to Joshua standing with his feet in the Jordan River. God tells him, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. So this is the charge that David leaves his son Solomon. But, you know, David also gave that practical advice. You know, he knew exactly how this was going to play out in future days for Solomon. So he was very specific here. He said for Joab, look at verse 6, deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. And for sons of Barzillai, show them kindness. They stood by me when I was fleeing from Absalom. And for Shammai, who called down curses on me, David tells Solomon, do not consider him innocent. You're a man of wisdom, Solomon. You will know what to do with him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. And also you know that after David's death, Adonijah broke his promise of good behavior, when he tried to trick Bathsheba into helping him usurp the throne from Solomon. Solomon saw that exactly for what it was. He acted swiftly. He eliminated Adonijah. And as far as Adonijah's supporters were concerned, Abiathar and Joab, Abiathar was defrocked. He was exiled, removed from the priesthood. And Joab, when he saw what was happening, where did he go? A place he had probably never been before. But he went to the tent, he grabbed the horns of the altar, and he thought, I've reached home plate, home base, I'm safe. Wouldn't come out. And Solomon said, well, take care of him where he is. And we can't forget Shammai. You remember the guy that cursed David and threw rocks? Grace was extended multiple times to Shammai. And Solomon had him on a leash. And then Shammai got off the leash and was disobedient. And so that was the end of him as well. In following David's final words of instruction of be strong and act like a man, walk in obedience, Solomon faced his challengers and he established his kingdom. These last words from David to his son were life-saving. These last words were kingdom-saving. What last words have you spoken that were life-saving? What last words have you spoken that were kingdom-saving? And guys, at this point, we got to remember that we don't know when we will speak our last words. So take an inventory. What were the last words that you spoke to family, friends, co-workers, or strangers that were life-saving? What words did you last speak that were kingdom-saving? The principle for this last division is the faithful are charged to be steadfast in the face of adversity. The faithful are charged to be steadfast in the face of adversity. And the application, who challenges you to act like a man and walk in obedience? Who challenges you to be that way? Who is the Nathan that's willing to be that for you? And who are you challenging? Who are you challenging to act like a man and walk in obedience? To whom are you being a Nathan? To paraphrase Tony Evans, a kingdom man is the kind of man that when his feet hit the floor each morning, the devil says, "Oh, rats." Now, Tony didn't say rats. He used a much more colorful word there, but we're going to use "oh, rats." So let's say that again. A kingdom man is the kind of man that when his feet hit the floor each morning, the devil says, "Oh, rats, he's up again." Tony continues, when a kingdom man steps out his door each day, heaven, earth, and hell take notice. Now, even Tony's going to agree with you and me that as kingdom men, our lives will not be safe. But we can all agree our lives will be significant. And William Barclay goes on to say that Jesus promised his disciples three things: that they would be completely fearless, absurdly happy, and in constant trouble. May we be such kingdom men. And it's not a matter of bucking up or manning up or what I've heard recently, cowboy up. That's not how we become kingdom men. We must be proactive and submit to God's will in our obedience. That's how we become kingdom men. And as David told Solomon, walk in obedience to Him. And as we sang tonight, we must surrender all to Him. And in His presence, daily live. We've talked about it before. We're called to dwell with Him, to abide with Him. We must understand that we're called to a personal relationship with God, our Creator. We're never going to become kingdom men, the men that God meant for us to be, until we have that personal relationship with Him, until we walk with Him in obedience. Let's pray.